I was camping in a Colorado woodland that I knew well. Although I lived a few hours away, I would occasionally get outside during pleasant weather. I had already spent 2 whole days setting up my camp. Those were the days I did not do anything but set up the tent and went fishing. However, I decided to go for a hike to the north of my campground on the third day. I was traveling in a broad route, partly up the mountainside, because there were no trails in that area. I was just enjoying the walk because I was familiar with all the markers around my camp, and I had everything I needed to make sure I didn't get lost. This was probably a little after noon, and as I ascended a bit farther, I saw a column of smoke rising behind me. It appeared as though it was coming directly from my campground. I moved around to attempt to get a better look, and from what I could see, there was a fire someplace nearby at my campground. Hastily returning, I headed back, fearing for my life. I had no notion, though, because I knew I hadn't left the fire going. It became increasingly clear that the smoke wasn't coming from my camp until I had moved away from its base by about 1/4 of a mile. I returned to confirm, and there were no issues at all. However, I could not see much since the smoke was pouring from so near to the edge of the trees. I considered going to investigate, but at this point, the only thing it could be was someone else's campfire. Again, no paths led to this particular site, so it was odd that someone else managed to be out here at the same time as me. But I kept at my camp because I didn't want to meet any random folks here. I carried on with my day and did some other things around the camp without giving it any more thought. It was probably an hour or so later when I glanced around idly, and my body tensed up at the sight of a man standing in the jungle. He seemed to be staring at me from the way he was standing, which made it all the more shocking. I had no idea how long he'd been there, being so blind. I raised my arm and waved nervously, but the man didn't return the gesture. He was facing the campsite, but I couldn't tell if he was observing me from where I was. I returned to my work after a minute, but I continued to keep my eyes open and occasionally checked. Before he left, the man stood in the same location for over 15 minutes. I was a little uncomfortable about that since it seemed like there was no justification for someone to be acting that way. I watched my surroundings for a few hours, and then I went to where I thought I saw the man standing. I looked around to see if there was anything that might have caught his interest, but nothing caught my eye. It was just one more area of the woodland. Just as the sun was setting, I returned to my camp. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head and that it was nothing, but the more I gave it some serious thought, the more uneasy I felt. But by the time the sun had set, I was still missing something. I started the fire when I was seated directly outside of my tent. I was out there for at least an hour when I observed a flickering light to my left, though I'm not sure how long I was there. It came from a different campfire in the nearby forest. Strangely enough, though, it wasn't in the direction I had noticed the smoke earlier in the day. I'd seen the man there, or quite close. I got to my feet, feeling that unsettling feeling rising within me once more. I could see the campfire's base as I looked closer, but no one appeared to be in the area. I carefully scanned the entire area as I swept my gaze around the dark trees. Glancing around, I noticed something more 10 or 15 feet away, hidden behind a shrub. There was a face staring back at me. The instant tension and terror that shot through me hurt my heart. However, in the brief moments I spent staring at them, it appeared as though the figure didn't believe I could see him. He was staring at me again, but he didn't move. I retreated a short distance, positioning myself behind my campfire and maintaining a fixed gaze on the man. It felt like the slowest 30 minutes of my life, but then I saw the figure start to backtrack deeper and deeper into the forest. He remained squatting and retreated gradually till the darkness of the trees completely engulfed him. For the entire night, I kept my eyes wide open and moved in various directions, but I didn't see anything else. I packed up and left as soon as the sun began to shine brightly enough to illuminate the woodland, moving as quickly as I could to return to my car. Something told me not to stay there any longer since whatever was going on there was far too strange, and I would only end up finding out how bad they probably intended to become. This occurred a year ago, and I'm a male 26 years old. I was going on a solo trip, and I was going to be staying at a friend's cabin close to the destination. I was appreciative that everything went well and that I was able to save a ton of money. I had never gone to this cottage they owned, but I had seen images and heard my friend rave about it frequently. I wanted this trip to be as comfortable and relaxed as possible, and it sounded like the most wonderful place to be. It felt somewhat far away from the nearest town, which was around 40 minutes away, although part of that distance could be attributed to the fact that it was on a dirt road that required cautious driving. Regardless, I must have stood outside appreciating the tranquility and the scenery for a full hour when I first arrived. After preparing an early dinner and spending some time on my phone, I decided to take a little walk to make the most of the remaining daylight. While I was standing outside the cabin, I saw that there were other little trails around. My friend reassured me that I didn't need to worry when I texted him to make sure they were trails and wouldn't get me lost. The nearest one, according to him, was a simple straight path that led through and out of the trees behind the cabin. I thought it sounded ideal, so I put on my walking boots and headed down the path. The walking track wasn't the smoothest, but it wasn't too horrible either. My main worry was that it wasn't something I could get lost in. I strolled for a little under 30 minutes, taking in the scenery and allowing my thoughts to wander, until I heard something that enough perplexed me to make me halt. But when I stopped listening, it became silent. Then, a little later, I heard it once more. The harsh, raised voice of a guy. Still, it sounded a little far. I scanned my surroundings in the woods, attempting to figure out where the man was. Somewhere far off to the right of the trail, I heard him speak again, but I was still unable to see him. But it sounded like he was shouting at someone or conversing with someone. Although I didn't want to go off the track, there seemed to be a problem with this. It was interesting that they weren't on the trail, but I couldn't tell if that was unusual for anyone to be along this trail because I didn't know if any other houses or cabins were out there. I listened for a few more minutes, during which I heard the man become enraged and say various things. I couldn't understand him because it wasn't in English, and oddly, no one ever answered. Not loud enough for me to hear, anyhow. I finally decided to move a little closer in an attempt to see who was there. I just wanted to make sure that nothing strange was going on. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. As I made my way deeper into the trees, I was cautious not to lose sight of the trail. But as I approached, the shouting and talking ceased. I jogged back to the trail after feeling anxious for a little while. Being in the woods was probably the last place I wanted to feel threatened by all that was going on. It just felt like I was in danger. I knew it was time to head back to the cabin because the sun was starting to set. I moved fast, and after only a few minutes, I heard the sound of leaves crunching in the nearby woods. I jerked my head around, but my vision was obscured by the trees' shadows. It sounded like someone was sprinting not too far behind me in the woods. After turning back, I dashed the remaining distance to the cabin, entered, and secured everything. Upon opening the rear window, I noticed a man approaching the cabin. He held something in his hand and wore a thick sweater. I made the hasty and desperate decision to grab my car keys and flee to the front of the cabin. I saw no one follow after I got in and drove off. My acquaintance was quite clear throughout our conversation that nobody ought to have been outside. I don't know what that man was doing or who he was yelling at, but I most likely wouldn't have been seen again if I had stayed in the cabin. I was camping in a Colorado woodland that I knew well. My residence was a few hours distant. Living in a tiny town outside of Seattle, my friend and I had developed a strong interest in camping and hiking over the previous few years. Something about erecting a camp and spending time in the bush with the animals struck a different chord. It was spring 2021 when this occurred. We had arranged a standard camping vacation not too far away, but it required some adjusting to find a decent few days to travel because of our sometimes incongruous work schedules. However, everything got twisted up when my manager had to push back my desired days off by one day in the days before. When I told my friend, Brandon, that it was only a day off, he said it was fine and that he would hike out there, set up camp, and spend the first night by himself. Who was I to stop him? He insisted on doing it and stated he would love it. He informed me when he arrived, set everything up, and everything appeared to be in order. I got in my car and headed to the campsite early the next morning. This wasn't a popular location, primarily because there were so many other campsites nearby, but it wasn't just any old random spot in the forest either. It had a well-made trail and a cleared-out site intended for campers to stay at. While I was traveling, I contacted him, but I lost service before I could get a response. My phone briefly gained service a few times during the trek, but I still hadn't received a text message. I was a little startled that I didn't receive a text back, but there were a million explanations for why it could have been because of service problems or a problem with my phone. However, when I arrived at the camp, something was absent. "Brandon," I yelled, looking about the tent and the surrounding grounds, but he was nowhere to be found. I wasn't overly concerned yet. I was aware that he had access to a few locations, including a couple of picturesque trails and a nearby river where he might have gone fishing. It truly didn't matter where he was. I set up my tent, set my luggage down, and lit a fire to reheat some canned food I had brought. Since it was just midday, he most likely wouldn't return until 3 or 4 in the afternoon if he had gone to the river or along a trail. However, when 5:00 approached, I became anxious. Since I had no idea which way he might have gone, I tried to see if I could make out any shoe prints. There were numerous, haphazardly placed shoe prints everywhere. It was still not possible for me to find him outside, as my phone was unreliable. The only sensible thing for me to do was to stay put and hope he returned. Hiking outside when there were barely 30 minutes of remaining daylight was a surefire way to end badly. I sat down, putting more wood on the fire, and hoped for the best, but secretly dreading the worst. I then noticed a light flashing by some trees up ahead. It was close to one of the pathways and moved as though someone was walking with it. I was relieved since I assumed it was Brandon. The light drew nearer, stronger until it was close enough that I could hear distant footfall. But suddenly, just as I was beginning to figure out who it was, it turned off, and the footsteps ceased. "Brandon?" I exclaimed. There was no movement or reaction, just silence. My stomach seized up, and I yelled, "Brandon, who's out there?" Once again, it said nothing, which confirmed my unsettling intuition. Even worse, for more than an hour, I waited and listened while staring into the darkness, and all I could hear was the sound of the woods. Though I never heard him go, I had the impression that he was still there, observing me. I got up and set to work packing, moving fast but keeping an eye on my back. I just felt like leaving and getting help, so I followed that instinct. Since I left without any further difficulties, I don't suppose I was followed, but the police couldn't assist me until the next day. When we returned outside, everything was as I had left it, but Brandon was no longer there. They followed him as he strayed from the path and ventured further into the forest, leaving a second pair of footprints directly beside his. Sadly, Brandon never showed up, and after a few days, nothing more came of it. The person who was out there with him is thought to have stolen him, and that person is probably the same one I'd met. It's awful to consider how things may have turned out if I had been allowed to accompany him on the first day, or if I had simply vanished.